And in 2022, a total of 330,000 illegal border crossings into the EU were detected, an increase of 66% compared to 2021. Of course, it's worth noting that most numbers relating to illegal migration are approximations. Nobody knows the true number of illegal arrivals, and estimates in this area very rarely turn out to be lower. America faces similar challenges. Thousands of people illegally cross the border on a daily basis. Illegal migration to the US has in recent years gone from just under 2 million in 2021 to more than 2.8 million this year. Illegal migration is not merely an event-driven or cyclical problem. It's a permanent and structural challenge for the developed nations in general and the West in particular. Unless we act, it will only worsen in the years to come. War, political instability, and climate change will, of course, exacerbate migration flows. According to the UN, at the end of 2022, there were over 108 million forcibly displaced people globally, with 29 million considered to be refugees by the UNHCR. But we must be honest. The fundamental drivers of this epoch-defining challenge are economics and demography. In January, the World Economic Forum said that migration will become one of the top 5 global risks in the next decade, ahead of national resource crisis, geo-economic confrontation, and environmental disasters. It's a fallacy that as countries get richer, emigration from them declines. As the American economist Michael Clemens has found, emigration from a country tends to rise until it reaches a level of income of about $10,000 per person before declining. World Bank data show that more than 3 billion people live in countries where the average income is below this threshold. The potential for migration to increase yet further is truly colossal. The raw numbers show how demand for migration, legal or otherwise, is likely to surge in the coming years. So too does personal testimony. A 2021 Gallup poll found that 16% of adults worldwide, around 900 million people, would like permanently to leave their own country. And those numbers are not evenly distributed around the world. 37% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa, some 481 million people, and 27% of those living in the Middle East and North Africa, around 156 million, say they'd like to migrate. The ease with which some of them might reach Europe poses a unique and deepening challenge. The fact is that our countries are exceptionally attractive. 4% of those polled by Gallup, approximately 40 million people, named Britain as their preferred destination. 18%, approximately 162 million people, named the USA. These numbers are respectively more than half of our current total populations. Now, those in favour of a more liberal approach when it comes to legal migration tend to say at this point, so what? Isn't it a good thing that people the world over want to come to the West and contribute? And why can't we absorb and welcome them? And wouldn't the problem of illegal migration be significantly reduced if we made it easier for people to come to our countries legally? Well, there are 4 core arguments in opposition to uncontrolled and illegal migration: the civic argument, the practical argument, the security argument, and the democratic argument. Firstly, the civic argument against uncontrolled and illegal migration. I believe that the nation-state is one of humanity's great civilizing forces. It creates a shared identity and a shared purpose, and that does not need to have a racial component. Typically, it binds people of different racial backgrounds together. Far from being an ugly emotion, patriotism stirs people to heroism and to kindness. It is the belief that we have specific obligations to others precisely because They are our fellow countrymen. And in order for nationality to be sustainable, economically, culturally, and in terms of public support, it needs to encompass everyone. That, in turn, means that the country cannot grow exponentially and still maintain the harmony needed for everyone to feel that we are all in this together. And let's remember something that is all too often forgotten. Integration inevitably takes time. If immigration is uncontrolled, it makes it harder for society to adapt and accommodate new cultures and customs, and for communities to meld together. Uncontrolled immigration, inadequate integration, and a misguided dogma of multiculturalism have proven a toxic combination for Europe over the last few decades. I'm not the first to point this out. In 2010, Angela Merkel gave a speech in which she acknowledged that multiculturalism had utterly failed. And then French President Nicolas Sarkozy and British Prime Minister David Cameron echoed similar sentiments shortly thereafter. Multiculturalism makes no demands of the incomer to integrate. It has failed because it allowed people to come to our society and live parallel lives in it. They could be in the society, but not of the society. And in extreme cases, they could pursue lives aimed at undermining the stability and threatening the security of our society. We are living with the consequence of that failure today. You can see it play out in the streets all over Europe, from Malmo to Paris, Brussels to Leicester. It is 13 years since Merkel gave her speech, and I'm not sure that very much has changed since. If people are not able to settle in our countries and start to think of themselves as British, American, French, or German, then something is going badly wrong. National identity is not something invented in an ivory tower or by advertising executives. The nation state has endured because it means something real to almost all of us, and that is true the world over. Given how much it matters, it must be protected. Saying so does not make one anti-immigrant, nor does it mean you're anti-immigration. I am the child of immigrants, and it's no betrayal of my parents' story to say that immigration must be controlled. There is an optimal level of immigration. It is not zero. But there has been more migration to the UK and Europe in the last 25 years than in all the time that went before. It has been too much, too quick, with too little thought given to integration and the impact on social cohesion. And the fact that the optimal level is hard to define and will vary across time and for different countries doesn't change that fundamental fact. Nor should it blind us from this simple truth. If cultural change is too rapid and too big, then what was already there is diluted. Eventually, it will disappear. Secondly, the practical argument against uncontrolled and illegal migration. The unprecedented rise in illegal migration to the UK via small boat crossings from France has put unsustainable pressure on the UK's asylum system and the British taxpayer. Approximately 109,000 people have illegally crossed the Channel via small boats since 2018, including 45,000 alone last year. Consequently, the cost of the UK's asylum system has roughly doubled in the last year and now stands at nearly £4 billion. A decade ago, the total cost of the taxpayer was around £500 million. The UK is now spending £8 million a day on accommodating migrants in hotels. And we are not unique in these challenges, of course. In March, roughly 1/3 of all hotel rooms in Ireland were being used to accommodate asylum seekers and refugees. In New York City is accommodating some 40,000 migrants in hotels. Earlier this month, New York's Democratic Mayor Eric Adams exclaimed that the migrants' crisis will destroy New York City. Recent analysis suggests that it will cost New York approximately $10 billion annually to support the roughly 110,000 asylum seekers who have arrived there after crossing the southern border this year. Unless countries can prevent or rapidly remove illegal migrants, pressures on the state will compound over time. Accommodation cannot be magicked out of thin air, nor can new schools, improved roads, extra police officers, additional healthcare, or any of the other public services upon which people rely. Immigration is behind at least 45% of demand for new housing in England. More than 1 in 5 births are to foreign-born mothers. Due to immigration and high birth rates among foreign-born mothers, English secondary schools will need to find an extra 213,000 places by 2026 compared to 2020. And then, of course, there are the direct financial costs. A 2014 study by University College London concluded that almost no illegal migrants end up paying in taxes what they gained from the state in benefits. Thirdly, the national security case against uncontrolled and illegal migration. Illegal migration also poses obvious threats to public safety and national security. UK police chiefs have warned me of heightened levels of criminality connected to some small boat arrivals, particularly in relation to drug crime, exploitation, and prostitution. People who choose to come across the Channel illegally from another safe country have already showed contempt for our laws. President Macron claimed that illegal migrants, or those waiting for a residence permit, accounted for more than half of crime in Paris. Illegal migration is increasingly a tool exploited by hostile states and those acting on their behalf. Vladimir Putin weaponized migration in 2021, sending thousands of asylum seekers via Belarus to try to cross into Poland and Lithuania. In March, Italy's defense minister said the exponential increase in the migratory phenomenon departing from African shores is also, to a not insignificant extent, part of a clear strategy of hybrid warfare that the Wagner division is implementing, using its considerable weight in some African countries. And fourthly, and perhaps most critically, the democratic case against uncontrolled and illegal migration. Opinion polls and successive national votes could not be clearer. People the world over want their governments to control their borders. The British public backed the UK's Rwanda partnership and the government's recent Illegal Migration Act by margins of about 2-1. 6 in 10 in red wall seats support stopping migrants in small boats from illegally entering the UK by using any means necessary. 72% of EU citizens are in favour of reinforcing EU external borders. And more than half of Americans said there was an invasion at the southern border when polled in August 2022. Who we allow to come into our country and become one of us is a fundamental issue. Without public consent, immigration is illegitimate. Dismissing as idiots or bigots those members of the public who express legitimate concerns is not merely unfair, it is dangerous. Europe is at a critical juncture. The EU must find a way to meet the challenge of illegal migration. Ursula von der Leyen's recent visit to Lampedusa demonstrates the Commission's recognition of the severity of the situation. Because failure to do so I fear, undermine the legitimacy of democratic institutions and create the conditions for more extreme politics. The UK is working closely with our European allies, both on the continent and in joint efforts upstream to combat the smuggling gangs and better secure Europe's borders. And we will always look for ways to deepen our cooperation on security. The most recent example is our new working arrangement with Frontex. To address where the solution to all of this might lie, I must first broach a taboo. One of the most significant but underappreciated factors contributing to the global migration crisis is the global asylum framework. By this, I mean the various well-intentioned legal conventions and treaties that say, in effect, if you are fleeing persecution somewhere, you are entitled to make a claim for asylum anywhere. And irrespective of whether you arrived illegally or passed through multiple safe countries along the way, a country must consider it. According to the UN, an estimated 50,000 people have died attempting dangerous and illegal migration since 2014, although the actual figure is almost certainly higher. About half of these deaths occurred while attempting to cross the Mediterranean. 1,000 people died last year trying to cross from Mexico to the US. And some 150 people have died attempting to cross the Channel by small boat, lorry, or other clandestine means in the last 5 years. All of these people were no doubt seeking a better life. Some, perhaps many, were genuine refugees, but not all of them were. Seeking asylum and seeking better economic prospects are not the same thing. Seeking refuge in the first safe country you reach, or shopping around for your preferred destination, are not the same thing. Being trafficked, i.e. transported against your will, perhaps to be sold into sex slavery, and being smuggled, i.e. asking someone to sneak you into a country, are not the same thing. The extent to which the global asylum framework enables the obscuring of these categories creates huge incentives for illegal migration. This legal framework is rooted in the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. It was created to help resettle people fleeing persecution following the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, and was, initially at least, centred around Europe. It was an incredible achievement of its age. But more than 70 years on, we now live in a completely different time. Jet travel has transformed the cost and comparative ease of moving around the world. The internet has made people acutely aware of how different life is and how much higher wages are in other parts of the world. Smartphones enable smugglers to facilitate operations with great ease and smooth communication between those who have undertaken a journey and others who might like to. When the Refugee Convention was signed, it conferred protection on some 2 million people in Europe. According to analysis by Nick Timothy and Carl Williams for the Centre for Policy Studies, it now confers the notional right to move to another country upon at least 780 million people. It is therefore incumbent upon politicians and thought leaders to ask whether the Refugee Convention and the way it has come to be interpreted through our courts is fit for our modern age or in need of reform. Article 1 of the Convention defines the term refugee as applying to those who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, cannot safely reside in the country of their nationality. Elsewhere, the Convention speaks of life or freedom being threatened. I think most members of the public would recognise those fleeing a real risk of death, torture, oppression or violence as being in need of protection. However, as case law has developed, what we have seen in practice is an interpretive shift away from persecution in favour of something more akin to a definition of discrimination. And there has been a similar shift away from a well-founded fear towards a credible or plausible fear, the practical consequence of which has been to expand the number of those who may qualify for asylum and to lower the threshold for doing so. Let me be clear, there are vast swathes of the world where it is extremely difficult to be gay or to be a woman, where individuals are being persecuted, it is right that we offer sanctuary. But we will not be able to sustain an asylum system if, in effect, simply being gay or a woman or fearful of discrimination in your country of origin is sufficient to qualify for protection. Article 31 of the Refugee Convention makes clear that it is intended to apply to individuals coming directly from a territory where their life was threatened. It also states that where people are crossing borders without permission, they should present themselves without delay to the authorities and must show good cause for any illegal entry. The UK, along with many others, including America, interpret this to mean that people should seek refuge and claim asylum in the first safe country that they reach. But NGOs and others, including the UN Refugee Agency, contest this. The status quo, where people are able to travel through multiple safe countries and even reside in safe countries for years while they pick and choose their preferred destination to claim asylum, is absurd and unsustainable. Nobody entering the UK by boat from France is fleeing imminent peril. None of them have good cause for illegal entry. The vast majority have passed through multiple other safe countries, and in some instances have resided in safe countries for several years. There is a strong argument that they should cease to be treated as refugees during their onward movement. There are also many whose journeys originate from countries that the public would consider to be manifestly safe, like Turkey or Albania or India. In these instances, most are simply economic migrants, gaming the asylum system to their advantage. In Europe, we've added, through the European Convention on Human Rights, additional human rights laws. The global asylum framework is a promissory note that the West cannot fulfill. We have created a system of almost infinite supply, incentivizing millions of people to try their luck, knowing full well that we have no capacity to meet more than a fraction of the demand. Tragically, the ease with which this system can be gamed by those that don't really need it means it is the most vulnerable, women, children, those without the money to pay people smugglers, and those not fit enough to make arduous journeys, that lose out. In the UK, roughly 70% of those arriving illegally on small boat are men aged under 40. This is a hypocritical position for the West to maintain, and by creating a market for people smuggling, it is leading to considerable human suffering. So why has the international community so far collectively failed to explore any serious reform of the global asylum framework? I think there are two main reasons. The first is simply that it's very hard to renegotiate these instruments. If you think getting 27 EU member states to agree is difficult, try getting agreement at the United Nations. The second is much more cynical. The fear of being branded a racist or illiberal. Any attempt to reform the Refugee Convention will see you smeared as anti-refugee. Similar epithets are hurled at anyone who suggests reform of the ECHR or its court in Strasbourg. I reject the notion that a country cannot be expected to respect human rights if it is not signed up to an international human rights organisation. As if the UK doesn't have a proud history of human rights dating back to Magna Carta, and the ECHR is all that is holding us back from becoming Russia. America, Canada, New Zealand, and Japan seem to manage just fine. None of this is particularly novel, nor should it be particularly controversial. As Home Secretary, Theresa May called for Britain to leave the ECHR, and it was Conservative Party policy under Michael Howard to leave the Refugee Convention. I'm merely advocating for reform. Now, while the underlying framework is both a contributing factor to the problem and a barrier to certain fixes, some countries have been more successful in tackling illegal migration than others. Australia had to cope with two major waves of illegal maritime migration across the Pacific in the last 2 decades. In the last wave, before they stopped the crossings, more than 52,000 unauthorised maritime arrivals and around 1,100 deaths at sea were recorded between 2008 and 2014. Operation Sovereign Borders saw migrant boats intercepted, and then those on board were either returned whence they had travelled or taken to immigration detention centres in third countries. There were some 400 illegal boat crossings in 2013, the year the operation was enacted. Within a year, the problem was eliminated. Denmark, between 2015 and 2016, announced a range of measures intended to make their asylum system significantly less attractive as a destination for illegal migration. The result was a reduction in claims from 21,000 in 2015 to 6,000 in 2016 and 1,500 in 2020. For every one asylum seeker that arrived in Denmark in 2021, 3 arrived in Sweden on a per capita basis. So unilateral and bilateral solutions and policies of deterrence can and do work. This is the route the UK has chosen to go down. In 2022, some 12,000 Albanians entered the UK illegally via small boat. In response, we strengthened how we worked with Albania, including improved data sharing, closer operational working, new expedited returns arrangements, and financial support. These measures have seen the number of Albanian small boat arrivals fall by 90% so far during 2023. We also work closely with France. Last year, the Prime Minister signed a historic bilateral agreement to deepen our cooperation in combating illegal migration. That included significant investment to increase frontline staffing and policing levels in northern France, better real-time intelligence and data sharing, supported by embedded UK officers, and improved intelligence cooperation to increase disruptions, arrests, and prosecutions. This sort of cooperation is necessary, but not sufficient in terms of results. Overall crossings are down more than 20% so far this year, compared with 2022. The system that we are working to deliver through our Legal Migration Act is one that, within the limitations of the broader rights-based framework, says that the only route to asylum in the UK must be a safe and legal route. Anyone who enters the UK illegally will be deemed inadmissible to our asylum system, and following assessment will be detained and swiftly removed to their home country if that's safe, or to a safe third country if not. In 2021, we signed our groundbreaking migration and economic development partnership with Rwanda. Under this agreement, Rwanda will accept physical and legal responsibility for illegal migrants relocated from the UK and look after all their needs while their claims are considered, with a full package to support their integration into Rwandan society. We always knew that our partnership would be challenged in court, and we remain confident that the UK Supreme Court will uphold the legality of the scheme later this year, enabling us to start putting it into operation. While our political opponents, NGOs and others dismissed the partnership as an immoral gimmick when it was first announced, it is striking how many countries run by governments of varying political hues have now expressed in public and in private conversations their support for this model. Many are now pursuing variations of their own. The UK will continue to prioritise policies of deterrence and border hardening alongside the maintenance of safe and legal routes. At the same time, we will look to build consensus for more fundamental reform of the asylum framework at the international level. The goal for reform must be to embed certain principles in the global asylum framework. Deterring illegal migration must be an aim. Countries must have a say in what volume of refugees they are capable of resettling each year. Support and protection should, to the fullest extent possible, be rendered in neighbouring safe countries where it is most efficient to deliver and able to reach those that need it most. The only route to resettlement should be via safe and legal routes. People must claim asylum in the first safe country they reach. The definition of who qualifies for protection must be tightened, And policies of externalisation, such as our partnership with Rwanda, must be recognised as appropriate. I don't accept the false choice between acting unilaterally or even bilaterally to protect one's border and solving this problem through multilateral cooperation. International cooperation is essential if we are to find enduring solutions to the challenges of global migration and deliver an asylum framework fit for the modern age. But nations cannot simply sit on their hands while a reform process plays out. It is right that they act in their national interest. I have, in recent weeks, been meeting with fellow interior ministers in Europe. I will continue doing so in the coming months and hope to bring together partners to a forum where we can begin discussing some of the matters that I've touched on today. Is the Refugee Convention in need of reform? Would a revised global asylum framework work, and how would it look? How can we better balance national rights and human rights so that the latter do not undermine national sovereignty? Could the ECHR be more transparent and accountable in how it interprets human rights and give greater power to nation states to make arguments and present evidence? What are the appropriate criteria for being labelled a refugee these days in the 21st century? How can we stop human rights laws being gamed by smugglers? Are we delivering safe and legal routes in an efficient and effective manner? And while we may have different views as to the solutions, I hope we can at least agree on one thing, that we are living in a new world bound by outdated legal models. It's time that we acknowledge that. Thank you. But what I think is a legitimate question for all of us to be asking in the UK is whether its operation and its interpretation by the courts is compatible with our pressing need to control our borders and national sovereignty. We've engineered and struck a groundbreaking deal with Rwanda. We believe that to be in compliance with our international obligations and compatible with international law frameworks. We've just passed new legislation in the form of the Illegal Migration Act. We also consider that to be compliant. So we are wanting to work within those frameworks, and we are confident that we can achieve that. But I do think legitimate questions need to be asked about the somewhat ill-fitting nature of how these, as I said in my speech, outdated international models are sitting with the global migration crisis of the 21st century.
How do you think about how those models have become outdated? The words on the page of the UN Convention have not changed, at least since the one protocol in the late 1960s. And yet, as you say, the practical forms they've taken and the actual practice of dealing with refugees all around the West, all around the world, have changed dramatically. How has that happened, and how would changing the words on the page actually address that problem?
I think a lot of the challenges we face are because of the jurisprudence and interpretation by courts and a more forward-leaning and expansive approach taken by judiciaries around the world. So whether it's in the context of the ECHR, we can see Article 3, which is the prohibition against torture, or Article 8, the right to family and private life, being stretched beyond all recognition to what the original intent of that convention was. In the context of the Refugee Convention, whether it's the definition of refugee, as I set out in my speech, or whether it's the definition and interpretation of refoulement, onward travel, those have both been subject to unforeseen and expansive interpretations by courts, and that jurisprudence and case law has then imposed greater burdens, I'd say unsustainable burdens, on governments around the world.
If we can untangle two elements of the way that you describe this in your remarks, the question of national sovereignty on the one hand, and the actual specific content and substance of the treaty commitments. You may know the United States was not an original signatory of the UN Convention on Refugees. The Truman administration in the 50s decided that it was too much of a violation of American sovereignty, and the United States stayed out of the treaty for 17 years until the late 60s. The objection there was a matter of sovereignty. They argued that the treaty would take immigration policy out of the hands of the U.S. government. The argument you're making seems to be more that the specific substance of the multilateral commitment is the problem. You do seem to think that there can be a multilateral way to deal with refugee issues, that there is a way for nations to agree on rules without losing control of their immigration policy. Is that right? You think multilateralism is the way to ultimately frame refugee policy?
I don't think these are mutually exclusive choices. I think there needs to be an international level approach which is consistent and has an equitable approach instilled throughout it. And that's why I'm calling for a renewed global conversation about the substance of some of these international conventions. And I believe that the nation state, its very concept and existence, is dependent on nationally elected governments, which are held to account by the electorate to take their own decisions unilaterally or bilaterally, in the way, for example, that we have done in the UK with our partnership with Rwanda, or defining and rolling out particular and bespoke domestic legislation.
So what is the right definition of refugee? In a sense, you put your finger on the problem that there really are people, many people, who really are endangered, really are in a position that is like the one that these treaties were intended to address. There are also people who are now covered by those definitions that are not in that position. If it were up to you, or if the process you're calling for were to start, what definition of refugee do you think would work in the 21st century? Who is a refugee now?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, as I pointed out in my speech, I think the definition has expanded beyond what is a reasonable and sustainable approach. And what we are seeing in the UK, at least, and in the EU, is that economic migrants are falling under the umbrella of refugee, whether through kind of illegitimate claims being made to mask the fact that they are economic migrants, or otherwise. And we have seen in our case law and what's been played out in the courts a disproportionate allowance being made for economic migrants under the guise of asylum law. And that line has been blurred. As I've said, people are leaving a safe country like France, coming to the UK and claiming asylum on a prima facie interpretation of the international text. That should not be allowed. But jurisprudence, case law, practice, convention has built up over time to render that not the case. So that's one very simple example of where
a reaffirmation of the existing definition is what would be important.
Yes. I think we do need to review that and look at it in the context of increasing numbers, increasing ease of travel, and pressures on countries.
So you're here to talk about these issues with your American counterparts. Mm-hmm. You're meeting with the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security and others. Do you have a sense of how they will respond to this argument? Do you have a sense of the Biden administration's attitude about the need to modernize the refugee arrangements, or in general a sense of their response to the situation they're dealing with at the southern border here?
Well, listen, I value the very good dialogue and relationship operationally that I have with my opposite numbers in the US administration, Secretary Mayorkas and Attorney General Garland. And the UK and the US, we share so many common values, and we're both grappling with this challenge in very similar ways. I'm keen to start this conversation. I have talked about it in other international fora with other international counterparts, and that has been something that's been met with, some level of support. So I hope that we can start amplifying this kind of global level conversation amongst like-minded nations. But listen, I commend Alexandra Mayorkas for the approach that is being taken here in America. For example, agreements with Mexico is very similar to how we've been working with France and with Albania to try and ease the flow. It's an incredibly complex, challenging situation, and it's very difficult to find nations who can declare victory on this problem.
We're going to take a couple of questions here in the room, but before we do that, just maybe one reflection on your own background as a daughter of immigrants. How does that shape how you approach these kinds of questions? These are obviously intense, contested questions in the UK as much as in the US. What do you think that background brings to the table for you? How do immigrant communities in Britain think about the refugee question at this moment?
Well, I have a somewhat personal experience of migration. My father came to the UK as a very young man. I think he was about 19, 18. He was effectively kicked out by Kenya in 1968. He always tells me movingly of the cold February morning that he stepped off the plane at Heathrow Airport. No friends, no money, no family, nothing but his British passport. And it was his British passport that was his symbol of hope. And he made his life in the UK, never once went back to Kenya. And I always think about the vulnerability that he must have experienced then. And my mother, she was recruited by the NHS as a girl of 18 in Mauritius. And she came over because the NHS was a symbol of excellence, of opportunity, and she came to contribute to the UK to make a better life. This is post-war in the 1960s. And they both signed up to British values wholeheartedly. They're fiercely proud of Britain, the British Empire. They're from former colonies, and being part of the UK in a full and energetic way. And they came here lawfully. They came to the UK lawfully, by the rules, occupying their place in the queue. And I think it's informed my view of migration. And what I think angers many people in Britain, whether they are from a migrant background or not, is the sense of unfairness, that people are jumping the queue, that they are breaking our rules, that they are coming here, gaming the system. The sense of unfairness, the sense of injustice, I think, is what really angers people in the UK, myself included.
Let's take a couple of questions in the room. We have just a few minutes. Maybe we can start back there. There's a microphone coming your way just a moment.
Thank you very much, Home Secretary. I'm Mark Stone. I'm from Sky News. Thank you for doing this. I just wanted to pick up on the anecdote you just gave, a very eloquent anecdote about your father, that he had no friends, no money, no passport, he wanted a better life. Do you accept that that is the story replicated throughout this migration journey? Every single one of those people has the same story that your father had. And I wonder how you could square that with your views that you have outlined this morning. And just to follow up, if I can, some have called your speech here grandstanding, and you can kind of see why. This is a very, very small room in America. You're speaking to a very small audience. And I wonder if this is perhaps more about your leadership ambitions of a party that's really quite struggling at the moment.
Well, addressing the first issue, I mean, what you're suggesting is because I'm the child of immigrants, I have to adopt a position which is pro-migration and pro the status quo. And I totally and fundamentally refute that. I think that is totally at odds with the challenge that we are facing today. Unprecedented levels of people coming to our country illegally with no right to be there, gaming our system, pretending to be refugee, pretending to be fleeing persecution, to come to the country illegitimately. And I mean, that cannot be how we conduct this conversation. We need to be honest with the British people, and we need to be honest about the challenges and the solutions. And just because I have an immigrant background does not exclude me from this conversation. And my job as Home Secretary is to be honest with the British people, to tell them that the system as it currently stands internationally is not working. We need to start working towards a solution that is sustainable and fair. Listen, I'm incredibly honoured to be here at the AEI. The AEI represents the forefront of thought leadership and policy making in the US and actually internationally. And to be hosted here to talk about migration in the international context, followed by meetings with my American counterparts, is really, again, part of my day job, part of my duty as Home Secretary. I want to lead this conversation globally, and I want to work with like-minded partners to find a solution.
Let's take one last question if we can. Right over here. No.
Thank you, Home Secretary. Tony Diver from the Daily Telegraph. Can I ask, if you don't agree with the UN Refugee Convention as it is, but you accepted in your speech that it's incredibly difficult to reform because of the number of signatories, can I ask, would you consider leaving the convention altogether if it is too difficult to reform? And just a short follow-up, with the Rwanda policy held up in court as it is, I know you discussed that as well, can I ask you how realistic you think it is that the government will still be able to reach the Prime Minister's pledge of stopping the votes by the next election?
Listen, just because multilateral negotiations are difficult, it's not a reason not to engage with international partners who are grappling with similar challenges and asking elemental questions about whether the frameworks are fit for purpose. And so I am seeking to build a consensus internationally. And ultimately, the Prime Minister himself has said, we'll do whatever it takes to stop the votes. And that's my position. And that illustrates the resolve, the intent and the commitment of the UK government to fix this problem, whatever is required. The second question was about...
how realistic do you think it is that the votes will be stopped? The Prime Minister seems to be less confidently possible.
Listen, I mean, we've made progress this year. We've passed the largest piece of legislation, the largest changes, set of reforms to our migration laws in a decade. We've passed our Illegal Migration Act. Many people said we wouldn't be able to get that enacted, and we achieved that goal earlier this year. We are now awaiting the decision, the hearing and the decision of the Supreme Court on our Rwanda agreement. I'm confident in the lawfulness of our agreement. I'm reassured by the fact that the Lord Chief Justice, the most senior judge outside the Supreme Court, found in the government's favour, the High Court found in the government's favour, and I hope that if we are successful in the Supreme Court, we will be in a position to operationalise flights to enable people to be removed and relocated to Rwanda as soon as possible thereafter.
Well, that's our time. Suella Braverman, Britain's Home Secretary, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.